Sometimes our program does not pass the test cases we define for it. When this happens and our test case fails, we say that we have found a bug. The name bug comes from for these defects comes from an era when computers were the size of a room, and once a computer actually stopped working because there was an insect, namely a bug, stuck in between the components. The process of finding the cause of the bug and fixing it is called debugging. There are many tools and techniques for debugging, but in this session we will be looking at the most effective one. This is called hand tracing. In hand tracing, we follow the code line by line using pen and paper and record the values of the variables involved in the code. Let's look at an example. Say we have two variables a and b, where a equals to 8 initially and b equals to 4, and we want to swap these values such that at the end a is equal to 4 and b is equal to 8. Let's say the code for this looks as follows. We run our program with the test case a equals to 8 and b equals to 4, and the expected outputs being a equals to 4 and b equals to 8. We can see that our test case has failed, and thus we have a bug. Let's proceed to debug our program using hand tracing. One way of going about this is to write columns for each variable and record their current values as we go through each line of the code. A possible setup looks like this. We then go through the code line by line and mark the values of the variables as we go through each line. It might be useful for you to mark each line as you pass it with a little dot. Initially, after the first line, the value of a is 8. After the second line, the value of a is 8 and the value of b is 4. After the third line, the value of a is 8, the value of b is 4, and the value of c is 0. The fourth line is where things start to get interesting. After the fourth line, the value of a is 4, the value of b is 4, and the value of c is 0. After the fifth line, the value of a is 4, the value of b is 4, and the value of c is 4. After the sixth line, nothing changes. A is 4, b is 4, and c is 4. Now we can go back through the columns and see where our variables do not have the values we expected. We can see that in this case, after the fourth line, we lost the value of a equals to 8. So we must fix our code to ensure that this does not happen. The code that achieves this is this. Please do a hand trace to ensure that the code is correct. Let's try something more complicated. Coming back to our sum problem, suppose we want to compute the sum of the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, all the way until a variable n, inclusive of n. If n is negative, the sum should be 0. Let's say the first value of n is 5, and our code is as follows. The code does not pass our test case. If n is equal to 5, the sum should be 15, and yet it is 6. What is happening? We set up our hand tracing like this, having a column for each variable in our code. In our case, n is always equal to 5. We will fill these columns as we follow the code through, line by line. The first value of sum is 0. The first value of I is 0 as we go into the for loop. The value of sum becomes 1. Our next iteration of the for loop, the value of I is 1 and the value of sum is 2. In our next iteration of the for loop, the value of I is 2. Next, the value of the sum becomes 3. And so on until the end, when I is equal to 5 and the value of sum is equal to 6. Can you spot the error? That's right. The code should say sum equals sum plus I, not sum equals sum plus 1. Let's try another example. Say we want to draw a grid of 5 by 5 red circles of radius 5, each of them being 10 pixels apart. The distance is calculated from their centers. Say the first circle is at x equals to 10 and y equals to 10. The code for this is this. Let's set up our hand tracing as before. Initially, I equals to 10. Then j equals to 10, and the first circle is drawn here. In the second for loop, j becomes 20, the condition is met, and the second circle is drawn here. We go through the second for loop again. J is equal to I plus 10, so its value is 20, the condition is met, and the third circle is drawn here. We go through the second for loop again. J is again equals to I plus 10, so its value is still 20, the condition is met, and the circle is drawn here. Do you see what's happening? The bug is in the second for loop. The correct code for this is this. Try to perform hand tracing to see that everything is correct. The more programs you debug, the quicker you'll get at spotting and crushing bugs. A good rule of thumb is to look first that all your variables are initialized and that all the conditions and the increments for the for loops are correct, and that all the if statements have the correct conditions, because this is where most errors occur. But remember, if stuck, the most effective technique is tracing the variable values.